Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask Kati Anything. I'm your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, Kati Morton. I'm so glad that you're here. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about how we can actually feel our feelings and stop intellectualizing them. And then I'm going to talk about grief and how we can better acknowledge and process it. Then I'm going to talk about why we can feel like our mental illnesses are sometimes made up or like we're exaggerating them because we haven't had a trauma or some big event to kind of necessitate them or make sense of them. Then I'm going to talk about the ways that we can healthily express our anger and how I define an eating disorder relapse. Finally, I'm going to walk you through the ways that I decide what is the human condition versus what is a symptom of a mental illness. Without further ado, let's just jump right in. Oh, and if you are looking to get your questions answered and you don't like asking them in this public of a way, or you've asked them and they don't get answered, I answer questions every month through YouTube memberships. I have 30-minute live streams twice a month, and I have 60-minute live streams twice a month. And depending on your tier, you have access to two of or all of those. And I also engage a lot and have live streams over on my Patreon page. You can go to patreon.com/Kati and you can find the information out there. Let's jump into question number 1. It says, how do I stop intellectualizing my feelings and feel them? Great question. And I struggle with this as well. Now, the first step when it comes to learning to feel our feelings is actually identification. And I know that might sound strange and you're like, but I can say like, hey, I feel sad, but that doesn't actually allow me to feel it. That's not the full process, but that's our first big step, because when we intellectualize, a lot of times we will try to make sense or reason with ourselves about why we feel the way we feel, or we will want to think about all the different ways it could express itself, or maybe all the different causes versus actually experiencing it. And so taking that time to, instead of try to make sense of the feelings or think about them or seek to, learn more about, we just want to stop with the identification. What is it that I'm feeling? What would I call this? Like, as, let's say, sadness creeps up on me, can I acknowledge, I'm feeling sad. Yeah, I'm feeling sad today. Kind of disappointed, actually. And dig in. It's almost like the feelings wheel. The reason I love it so much is those feelings in the middle are kind of more of our base feelings or primary feelings, meaning they're kind of the basis for a lot of others. So like I could say I'm angry, but I might actually be irritated. Do you see what I mean? And so those ones in the middle are usually like bigger, broader, and kind of more primary and more basic. As we get out, the feelings get more and more nuanced. And so you can use the feelings wheel to help, and it's okay to start in the middle and work our way out. So I could start off by saying I feel sad. And then as I think about it, I'm like, I'm actually not sad. I'm more disappointed. Yeah, I feel let down. Something was supposed to happen and someone didn't do what they said they were going to do, right? To think about it and to allow ourselves that moment, that's the experience of feeling it. I know it sounds weird. I know you're like, but Kati, is that it? Unfortunately, no. But that's the first step. Identifying how we're feeling. Give it a word. What is that word? Does that word feel true, or do you need to go out to a more nuanced one within that feelings wheel to identify it? And if you're wondering where the feelings wheel is, you can go to feelingswheel.com. It's right there. So that's that part. And then the second, and probably the hardest for most of us, is to identify or acknowledge where we experience it in our bodies. So if the thing is sadness that I'm feeling, that disappointment, does it feel like heaviness? Do I feel it in my chest? Is it in my stomach? Do I feel, Where is it? Does it make me want to clench my fists and maybe I'm really angry? Can we identify that? And through this process of calling out the name of the emotion, like actually identifying it, getting more nuanced, considering other emotion words and how we experience it in our bodies, that's the process of feeling. I know I could get into the nitty-gritty of like allowing yourself an opportunity to like think it through, but that's how we go about it. We have to identify what we're experiencing and we have to allow it allow ourselves to feel it in our bodies, not numb out from it, not push it away. And so that's how we stop. And I also think for me, as a side note of just my own personal experience, I try to be more aware of when I am doing my intellectualizing, like when I'm trying to, I don't know, learn more about something, or I'm thinking about something as if I'm my own therapist. I do that. Then I try to pay attention to that, acknowledge that I'm doing that, and then I distract. I try to do something else. Whoa, get that out, stop. So that then I can go back and try again. Try to like identify what it is, give it a name, consider where I'm feeling it in my body. Okay? I hope that helps. Obviously, there's a lot of other pieces we could add to it, but that's really how we stop doing that. And there was an add-on that says, Kati, how do I know if I am repressing emotions or just simply not being emotionally triggered or not feeling anything? How might I get more in tune with my emotions? That's a great question. And the truth is, we almost always feel something. I know for my numbed out folks, you're like, what? No, there's a lot of times I don't feel anything. Even when I feel nothing, okay? Not nothing, but like when I feel, I don't know, whatever. I might feel bored. I might feel comfortable. I might feel satiated. You're always feeling something. I honestly believe that unless we're asleep, and even then we're like having dreams and experiencing things, so we're feeling something, but I don't know if we ever don't feel anything. That's more of the numbed out. And so not being emotionally triggered means that you aren't feeling a big and strong emotion, and we might not be attuned enough to our bodies and our brains to recognize when we're feeling something mildly, like, oh, today's just pleasant. I feel satisfied. Like those aren't necessarily strong feelings, but they're still feelings nonetheless. And we might only be able to tap into our strong ones because they are such an intense experience. And so how do we know if you're repressing emotions or just not being triggered? If you're not feeling anything, chances are you're repressing. And so take a minute to check in with yourself and see if there's any tension anywhere in your body. Do you feel yourself like swallowing a lot, to like swallow tears or emotions, like, oh, got to get those down. Paying attention to that can really help. And you can see maybe from that personal research, you can see what's coming up for you, what you're doing to suppress the emotions. The final question, how am I to get more in tune with my emotions? I think a great tip for us starting out is each and every day. Not 7 days a week, because I don't like to ever give people homework 7 days a week, but let's say 3 to 5 days a week. Let's start with identifying one emotion each day. Maybe that emotion is frustrated. Maybe that emotion is excited. Maybe, I don't know, right? Just trying to come up with one each day, 3 to 5 times a week. Let's do that for a couple weeks until it feels almost silly. Like, oh, this takes 2 seconds. Let me just do this. Then I want you to move up to 2 to 3 emotions a day, 3 to 5 times a week. And we're just slowly getting to know what it is we're experiencing, what we're going through, and being able to identify it. And so that's really how we can get more in tune. Now let's move on to question number 2. It says, hey, Kati, I was curious if you could talk about grief as an emotion, of course, and how to cope with it and ways to help process it. Before therapy, I could not name any emotions, and I've gotten so much better at it. Yay. In fact, unbeknownst to me, I've actually been quite the adept feeler of emotions in the sense that I can find them in my body. I can talk about how they feel and the directions they move within me and through me. Name images and metaphors that come to mind, etc. And now that I'm better at naming emotions and feel more internally organized about all the things I feel, it's really helped me process a lot of trauma. However, grief absolutely baffles me. I'm constantly naming it confusion, and only recently, thanks to the help and guidance of an amazing therapist, have understood that oftentimes my confusion I'm naming is actually grief. I think I find that grief, the feeling, feels confusing because there's a sense of constantly assessing that something's off or that something is missing. Like in an internal back and forth between something I think that should be there but isn't actually there, which is how we realize that it could be grief. But then I just get stuck there. I know there's sadness and loss in grief, but I don't feel like I know how to process it. Do I just say this fucking sucks and it's life and I hate it? I guess that kind of makes me feel better to just acknowledge the helplessness, this sucks feeling. but it just feels like I'm not quite understanding what it wants from me or what I should do to help soothe it or soothe myself, I guess. I hope this all makes sense and isn't too out there, so to speak. LOL. Thanks so much for your time and consideration, Katie. You're a treasure. Oh, of course, of course. This is a great question. And I think for most of us, grief is confusing. It is messy. And I think, unfortunately, as a society, we've talked about grief like it's something that needs to be moved through, like check that box. Ugh, I grieved. Now I don't have to. And that's not to say that we shouldn't hope that our life grows so much larger around our grief that it doesn't affect us day to day. But the thought that we have to like move through it and it's something to process, I feel is incorrect. Now, hear me out. Yes, grief is an emotion, and I can talk about it from that stance. But grief is, I mean, I guess all emotions are experiences, but grief is one that I do not think we should try to make go away. Now, hear me out. Hear me out. Grief, unfortunately, is a reminder of something lost. Now, if it's grief of someone who's passed away, it's often a reminder of the relationship that was. And if it's grief because a relationship has ended, the person is still alive, it's what we could kind of call like, I don't know, maybe a more complicated grief or disorganized. That can come with a lot of, loss as well and reminders of the person being gone. And I think sometimes in our rush to move through it, we don't allow ourselves to really feel it and know that grief can kind of come and go just like any emotion. And so I don't want to get too off topic, but in what I believe about grief is that we shouldn't be focusing so much on the fact that we need to get to the other side. Because often I think when we consider grief, we think like, okay, something happens, there's a loss. I feel sad, I feel bad, I feel hurt, I feel whatever. And the goal is to move through the grief and to get on this other side. I need to get across this river, right? I need to get over there. And we focus so much on trying to get over there that we don't allow ourselves to be in the confusion of grief, in the loss, in the sadness, in the feeling like there's a missing piece, right? In the disappointment. I was super disappointed when my dad died because that meant he couldn't be there for all of the things that were important to me. My graduation from grad school, for example, my wedding. He didn't even know I had a YouTube channel because I hadn't started it yet, right? Like there's so many things he missed out on. And so I think the thought that we have to move through it and that we can't stumble upon new pieces of it is what's getting in the way. And so instead of feeling like we need to make sense of grief and it needs to be tied up in a pretty little bow and like very like made sense of, like sorted, right? Compartmentalized maybe. Instead of feeling like we have to get through it, what if instead we allow it to come and go like waves on the beach? Because I feel like there was a meme, and I shared this recently, how grief is really not something that we often think that we need to move through it and let go of it and it'll like be in our life and then not. Instead of thinking of it in that way, we need to think that our life will get so much larger that the grief won't feel as intense, but it'll still be there. And I know that answer sucks and it's kind of depressing, but that's really how I feel about it. Yes, we can process it. Yes, we can experience it, but that's not going to make the feeling go away completely because there's still that missing piece. There's still that thing that we wish we had. Does that make sense? I don't know. I hope so. But grief is very confusing and it's elusive and it comes and goes in waves. And it's almost like in some cases of what I would call milder symptoms of PTSD, maybe the early symptoms kind of feel like this, where they kind of pop in and pop out and we get triggered and we're like, and then they go away. And it's not consistent all the time at first. And I feel like grief is like that. Just that's how it is. When you're outside of the initial hurt, the initial grief experience, like when someone passes away, when a relationship ends. Otherwise, it's kind of just part of our life that we have to accept and seek to understand. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if it does. Let me know. Happy to keep talking about this because grief does suck. I'd like to tell you, oh, it's easy and you can move through it and it isn't a big deal. But as someone who's unfortunately experienced a lot of it, it gets lighter, but it is confusing and it's always there. And I don't think we need to move through it. I think we need to allow ourselves to feel it when it crops up and when it demands to be felt, right? And I think we could also say that a lot of emotions are like that in general. I think the urge to process it and move through it maybe comes from like your trauma work because you're making such progress there, but it's a little bit different. Grief is very different. And I think that's why it's so confusing, is because it doesn't allow itself to be thought of once and processed and move on, because it's not that, it's tied to something bigger. It's almost like if we were feeling anger about the fact that this person cut us off in traffic, that anger can come and it can go. We can allow ourselves to feel it. We can understand that it's because I'm stressed out, I'm anxious because I'm running late or whatever. Oh, we get angry and then it passes. That situation was very short-lived. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it had an emotional spark. Grief comes from something bigger. And so we can't move through it that quickly because it's still lingering, right? So, because if we felt anger in that same example, if we felt anger for the fact that, I don't know, we found out our mom had a whole nother family growing up, that's not going to be as quick to process as the fact that someone cut us off. And grief almost always comes out of those bigger picture, bigger issues. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Now there's a comment that says, as an add-on, how can grief be processed when one is surrounded by happiness? I just graduated high school and lost my grandpa at the end of this school year. Oh, I'm so sorry. The world feels like an endless gray field of hurt, but everyone else is celebrating graduation. If I join in, I just feel so fake, or worse yet, guilty and ashamed. How can I process this grief in the midst of celebration? Ooh, yeah, I feel that. It can feel inauthentic to celebrate. However, sometimes I think that we can give grief its chances and opportunities to express itself when it is best for us. Now, I know in the midst of like new grief, when it just happened, like when my dad just died, I would cry all the time randomly in places I didn't want to cry. And so I know that we can't like always hide it and do it at certain, like compartmentalize it to cry later or to feel the grief at specific instances. But I do encourage you to set aside time to just let yourself cry and grieve. Like in the mornings and the evenings, when you're in the shower, after a long day, whenever you know you have privacy, let's grieve then. Doesn't mean we can't grieve out in the world at other times, but there's nothing wrong with allowing ourselves to feel sad and miss our grandpa, but then go out and recognize, hey, I'm graduating high school. This is a big deal. I do want to enjoy all of the different events. And not to say I know your grandpa, but they wouldn't want you missing out on those things on their account. And it's okay to feel sad sometimes and then go out and also enjoy yourself. And I know it feels like those two things can't exist together, but I'm here to tell you that they can. Because once we get through what I call like almost like the trauma response of grief, like when it strikes, and we are impacted. And that's all we can think about. That's all we can do. And this can last for, a little while. But then once we get through that kind of trauma of it, then how do we still live our life and miss that person? Doesn't mean we're not going to miss them. Like I still miss my dad it's not that I don't miss him as often, but I'm not reminded as often, but I still miss him regularly. Like just the other day, I was like, oh, it'd be so nice if I could ask him about this. Right? And then I'm like, it's sad. The fact that I'm enjoying my life and maybe celebrating wins and things like that doesn't mean that I don't miss him or love him, or that I didn't grieve that or don't continue to grieve that. Right? And so those two things can actually coexist. We can grieve and celebrate our life simultaneously. I know it feels inauthentic or fake, and that's because we need to still make time for you to feel like you can grieve when you need to. If you want to cry, we need to make time in your life for that. I don't want you just to stuff it down and pretend. That's completely fake. But I want you to feel like you can cry and be sad. And then you can also shake that off and go out and enjoy the fact that you just graduated high school and people in your life are making choices and going different places and you want to see them before they leave. It's such a special time in life and I don't want you to miss out. And so make sure that you make time for the grief, but also make time for the celebration. Okay? I know that sounds like weird advice, but when I tell you I've been through it, and you can still You can still do it. You just have to give yourself that time to grieve. Otherwise, like when I did at the beginning when my dad passed away, I just tried to pretend nothing happened. And I would like have meltdowns at work and I'd cry in the middle of like a run. It was crazy. You guys, I was not taking care of myself. Do not recommend. 0 out of 10. But when I got into therapy twice a week and started just giving myself more of an opportunity to cry about it and process it, then I felt better. Then I was able to actually go out with my friends and enjoy things versus what I would do before was just like either stay home and cry or go out and feel like a phony and not be the best version of myself, you know? And so giving yourself that outlet is really key. Now there's another add-on. It said, adding on about grief, but this time about losing a friendship. I feel as if I hadn't the right to feel and process the loss of the special friend of mine, since I know I'm probably to blame for it. Regardless of who's to blame for the ending of a relationship, that doesn't mean that we still can't be sad or grieve the relationship that's lost. Those aren't mutually exclusive. And also because she's still alive and just that our paths split at some point. I know also that I should have other friends to rely on, but this girl was so special to me and I can't even appreciate my other rare friendships enough to not be overwhelmed by the end of this one. She had been my only friend for quite a long time and she helped me to stay when I had no reason to live. Sorry if this is raw, but it really is just the truth for a long time. The relationship ended abruptly and I feel like I shouldn't be so affected by it. Look at that judgment. Which leads me to stuff down, but to tell the truth, I feel so hurt I can barely breathe. I'm afraid to feel this. I'm ashamed of being hurt. She seems to have already moved on. I'm so sorry. I know my comment's really messy. I think it may represent how I feel inside. Yes, it probably does. That's why journaling's so helpful. It might represent how I feel inside about this friendship. I thought for one time in my life that I couldn't possibly be lost. How naive was I? Is it possible that someone may be inherently a bad friend? I'm afraid that I am this toxic person to be around. Is there a way to come out of this dark place that I'm in? Yes. And just like I said before, we have to give ourselves time to grieve. You're judging yourself so badly for this lost relationship, blaming it on yourself. Then I don't know why, but we're assuming that because it might have been our fault partially, that then we don't have a right to feel sad. I'd be interested to learn like why you feel like you don't have the right maybe to process and feel this loss. Like, I don't know how you earn that other than the fact that you were in the relationship and you've lost someone that you cared about. And so I challenge you to push back against that belief that like, I don't have a right, I shouldn't feel this way. That's what's making you feel worse. That belief that you shouldn't be grieving is what's keeping you held in your grief and making you feel like shit. Like you said, that this dark place that I'm in. That's your answer out. Is every time your brain's like, you know what? I don't have a right to feel this way. I shouldn't be feeling like this. And you try to do something else. Instead, I want you to lean into it. I want you to journal. These are the things that I miss about her. These are the reasons the friendship was so powerful. This is why it meant a lot to me. We have every right to grieve any loss that we experience. If it's a big deal to us, it's a big deal. It's valuable. It's not valuable. It's valid. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's in that judgment, in that I can't feel this way. That's where we're getting hung up. And so instead, let's push forward. Let's get ourselves to a place where we can, allow for some of that grief, knowing that we have every right to feel it. We were in that relationship too, and that relationship is lost. And that's all that it takes for us to have, the right to grieve. Now, another person said, yes, as an add-on, can you talk about how to let go? I mean, especially in terms of grief like friendships ending or people dying. I'm so terrible at letting go of anything. How can I improve? I've always enjoyed the letting it go idea, that when something like grief happens, that we're supposed to just let it go, like move on, move through it. Like I was talking about earlier, it's almost like we feel like we have to jump to the other side of that river. And I'm encouraging you to not do that. I'm encouraging you to let yourself feel it. We can't let it go because we haven't let ourselves feel it yet. We haven't allowed ourselves the opportunity to grieve. Does it mean that we'll ever completely let it go? Maybe not. But like I said, our life will grow around it so much so that the grief doesn't affect us day to day. It's still there, but it's not ever present, right? And so you don't have to let go of anything. You have to feel what is happening. You have to acknowledge the grief and let it as weird as it sounds to say, like wash over you. I feel like grief is like that. It's like this heavy wave of like, oh, like you're forced into it. And that's the best way to help you feel some relief. Because I have a feeling when you're asking about letting it go, it's like, I feel so heavy from this. How do I not? And the truth is it's through feeling it, through experiencing it. Okay? Let's move on to question number 3. This question says, hello, Katie. I often feel that my MDD, major depressive disorder, and GAD diagnosis, that stands for generalized anxiety disorder, are not warranted, and that it's all in my head because I have not experienced any major negative life events or traumas. This has prevented me from discussing the things that I believe could be contributing to my symptoms because they don't feel important enough, such as minor life events, experiences, attachment issues, etc. I've tried different SSRIs, SNRIs, etc., and I see a psychiatrist to manage my meds and a therapist for talk therapy. I've not found any relief yet over the years. Sometimes I also blame myself because maybe the drugs are working and I'm just not doing my part for the rest. Man, so much judgment. Not doing my part for the rest of the stuff. Or maybe it's just in my head, or maybe I'm minimizing their effectiveness while over-exaggerating my symptoms. Sometimes when I get a rare moment of relief, it's like proof to me that things could be better with all else being equal. The only reason they're not is my own fault for not trying hard enough or paying too much attention to the symptoms. Sometimes I feel bad about getting relief because it feels like I've been lying the rest of the time. Whenever I see a new therapist, I always feel the need to let them know ASAP that there are no skeletons in the closet. I've not experienced anything bad or traumatic in my life. I'm always afraid they'll be disappointed, like they've wasted their time in investigating if they realize later they don't have any quote unquote valid issues or problems. Do you have any suggestions for me? So many. First of all, you have to stop shitting on yourself. That's all you're doing. You're shitting on the fact that because you didn't have these like big life events or a major negative life event or a trauma, that then you can't have depression or anxiety. What? You realize that for a lot of people, they don't have a major life event. I know I talk about trauma a lot, and that's because it can be the basis for a lot of things, but we also can have depression because we have depression. There could be a genetic piece where like someone in our family, either our parents or aunt and uncle, grandma, grandpa, somebody had it. So we're more genetically predisposed to it. That could be why. We could have had a trigger where we got super stressed out. And so it caused these symptoms to begin. Does that have to be a major life event? No, it could be. I mean, I had a friend in high school go through a psychotic break. I know that's like more extreme on the symptom scale thing there, but he experienced that break when it was finals week. So it's just super stressful. So something like that could have caused it. It doesn't have to be a major life event. We don't have to have these huge impacts in order to warrant us having a mental illness. Mental illness doesn't even care about that half the time. Some of us, that's where it comes from, and that's the stem. But for a lot of us, it's not. And so I want you to stop that false belief that you have to have had this big major life event. Also, as a therapist, I can tell you that I'm doing the digging and kind of the investigation to try to figure out where this comes from for you. If it's not a trauma or a major negative life event, I'm not disappointed. It's actually relieving because that's less intense for you. That means less, work for you when it comes to like processing traumas. It means we don't have to do that part. We can move into the symptoms that are most bothersome to you and find better ways to manage. So there's no disappointment. As a therapist, I don't have any expectations with the patient. I just want to go in and try to figure out how this is affecting them, where we think it comes from, when it started, and all that good stuff. So I really think the biggest thing for you is negative self-talk. And this could be, you said there's attachment stuff. So I'm wondering if maybe like some of my inner child videos or my workshop or my attachment-based workshop or my videos on attachment, if those could be of assistance, that could probably help. I also want to think that and I don't say just to say it's easy, but noticing that talk when it happens, when we're talking shit and challenging ourselves to move it in a better direction. Doesn't mean it has to be positive, but again, it's like those bridge statements, right? It's just not quite as negative. So instead of thinking, hey, I don't have these big things and I have no reason to feel this way, right? Or, even like when you feel a little bit better, you don't get to get excited or enjoy it. You're like, oh, I'm just making things up, blah, right? All that shit talking. We need to be more aware of it, and we need to challenge it with something that is just a little less negative. So I want you to be aware. I feel like that's the first bit of homework, is to start noticing how you talk to yourself. That's it. Just notice. Because if we're not aware, we can't change it. The next step would be to try to challenge it with some facts and get in there with a little less negativity. So if we're thinking, I don't have a right to feel this way, I didn't have anything bad happen, can we say, Katie did say that for some people, I don't think this applies to me, but for some people, they don't have to have like a big bad event to warrant depression. Maybe that's it. And so just moving it a little bit at a time into a more positive space. Now there was an add-on, and it says, as an add-on and about figuring it out, if one struggles with generalized anxiety disorder or GAD. I was quote unquote only diagnosed with social anxiety and depression, but I noticed that I worry a lot about other stuff too. It's mostly about the future, like financial fears surrounding uni and relationships or losing them, or the fear of becoming homeless, although I rationally should know that it is an unrealistic fear to have for me. I have some obsessive behaviors too, but my therapist said I didn't seem as if I had something like OCD, and that it's normal to always check things a few times or have issues about touching some things without washing hands, which is why I don't want to ask her. Generalized anxiety disorder is when we have uncontrollable worry about a lot of different things, pretty much like what this person is experiencing. Now, when we're diagnosed with social anxiety, that means that our anxiety primarily, because it can happen, there's always things like outliers, but primarily it happens around social situations. So we get worried about being out with friends or people we don't know and embarrassing ourselves, or them thinking poorly of us, or us not knowing what to say, right? When it's all about social situations, it's called social phobia or social anxiety. However, the fact that you have a lot of uncontrollable worry about a lot of things makes me wonder if it is more GAD. And it is very normal, just FYI, for therapists to diagnose us with one thing and then later realize that, hey, we also need to include that. And so I know you said you don't want to ask her, but I would bring it up and say, hey, I was watching this video online about generalized anxiety disorder, and I feel like that fits better than social anxiety. Yes, I have social anxiety, but I feel like I also worry about all sorts of things. What do you think? Bring it up that way. Because even though our therapists or psychiatrists or whoever we're working with, they're the ones that have to diagnose us, you're the expert in you. And I never want to minimize that. As a therapist, I hope none of my patients ever felt like I minimize that, because I want to hear from you what symptoms are most bothersome. What are you experiencing? And then I put it into my brain of like knowledge of mental illnesses and their symptomologies and treatments. And I try to come up with what I think it is. But it's always an effort that we work on together. It's like a project, right? Because I'm like, okay, well, it could be this, or this. And then I'll tell you like, hey, it could be social anxiety. It could be generalized anxiety disorder. It could also maybe be part of OCD, right? And then we talk it out and we try to work it out together. Maybe I tell you a little bit about each. Maybe we rule them out together. Or maybe I come out of it thinking after a couple of weeks, I'm like, you know what? I think it's this. And then I get your input, because it should be something we work on together. Because like I've always said, and I used to say it back in the day with every video, with your experience and my expertise, we work together towards a healthy mind and a healthy body. And that's true. So I would bring it up because this is your diagnosis, this is your treatment, and we want to ensure that you're getting the right diagnosis and right treatment. Let's move on to question number 4. This question says, hi, Katie. I was wondering if you could talk about healthy ways to express anger happily. I come from a culture where expressing anger is shameful, especially for women. So my anger is scary as fire flames for me. However, I've noticed my binge eating is fueled by my unexpressed anger. Interesting. So can you please teach me some techniques about handling anger? Thanks for all your amazing work. Of course, I too did not grow up in a home where anger was expressed all the time in healthy or actually really unhealthy ways. So I was very unaware of how to express anger, and anger felt very out of control for me too. Now, the best way for me starting out, I'm going to start you back like when I was in high school / early college years. Expressing my anger was best done through writing it down, journaling. And I would you guys, I would rip paper. I'd write so hard, and I would write the nastiest shit. Anything come to my mind, like, I hated that person. I didn't cuss yet at that point. I don't know if you guys know this, but I was raised super Christian. And so I always thought it was really bad to cuss. And then it was my junior year of college. I met my girlfriend, Kim, and she cursed like a sailor. And she was like, it's just healthy, helps me express myself. And you guys, I've never looked back. And so journal and write some, whatever anger you need to express. Then you can rip that up or put it through a shredder. No one has to read it. It doesn't have to make sense, but it's about the getting it out. And I felt there was something cathartic about that for me, to get out the emotions and the thoughts, because what I learned about anger, as I'm sure you will, is that it's always kind of coming from somewhere else, meaning that like I felt angry because I felt hurt. I felt angry because I felt disrespected. I felt angry because I felt like I wasn't being taken seriously. You know, there's all sorts of different reasons we can feel angry, but that I learned that through that process. And so that's where I want you to start, is to start journaling about it, writing about it. I don't find typing on a computer to be even though I can write way, 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 way faster, it doesn't work as well for me. You can try it, but I find actually writing pen on paper is so much better. And I can even rip the paper, like I said. Make sure you have a notebook that you don't care if you like ruin a few pages, and just really get in there. So there's that. Then I also find talking about it, I talked about it in therapy a lot, about how upset I was, how angry I was, how agitated I felt. And then another thing I do, and everybody to their own, I'm just going through some of the ways that I express my anger. I scream. If Sean's not home, I'll scream in my house. I'll scream in the car. Yes, I scream into a pillow. Sometimes you just gotta like, are you fucking kidding me? You just gotta get it out. And it feels kind of good. I do know through research, and I forget when this came out, it's probably been a few years now, but we, rage rooms and things were like, smash shit and go and do this. And that's supposed to like help us express our anger. We actually find that doing that, like the physicality of like hitting things and breaking things, doesn't make our anger go down. It actually makes it go up. So just throwing it out there. That's probably why people don't feel better after they like get into a fist fight or anything, or I don't know. You can exercise. Exercise is another way to get the anger out. But I find for me, it just did not help, because I needed to talk it out. I needed to vent it out. I needed someone to know how angry I was. Even if, it was just me and my paper. Like I felt like I needed to get it out of my system. But body shakes also help. And those are just a couple of the ways. I'd love to hear from any of you in the comments if there is any way that you healthily express anger, or something that's really, really helped you move through it. But those are really the ways for me, is writing it out, shaking out, screaming. And then also after the fact, after like the edge is kind of taken off, then I try to figure out where it's coming from. Like, what am I really angry about? Can I be angry because I feel like no one's listening to me? Yeah. Am I angry because I feel maybe a little bit trapped, or I feel like I'm being blamed for something that's not my fault? There can be a lot of reasons that we're angry. Because I feel attacked. Think about it. And that's really helped. And I think it is also common in society for women. Women aren't supposed to be angry. And I know things are moving along and things are much more progressive, but for a lot of us, it's still like that. And there was this meme I saw, this is like months and months ago, but it said, I wonder how many women that think they're sad are actually just filled with rage. I was like, probably a lot of us. Because it's never been okay to express it. And so I challenge you to try those things and to start journaling about it and see what comes up, okay? And there's an add-on. It says, how do you learn to express anger? I suppress mine to a point where sometimes I don't even know if I can feel it. And if I got to the point of feeling it, how would I release the anger in a healthy way? I think I've talked about this actually through the other answer. I should have read them both at the same time. But we have to learn to express anger through trial and error. Now, the journaling really helped me. It might not work for you. I also, like I said, screaming and shaking out and maybe just moving your body, exercise is supposed to help. But venting and talking to other people about it helps me too. But there is also, I think, and maybe this is just me, but there's also this interesting thing about anger where it feels like if I entertain it for too long, meaning I like wallow in it and like want to tell everybody about how angry I am, that it only feeds on itself. Like it is like a fire, and I'm throwing gasoline on it. And so for me, the expression of anger is like, I need to get it out. I need to be swift about it. I need to talk to people about it. And then like, let's say like a week or two later, I don't know, depends on the situation. Then I need to dig into like why I'm so angry. Like, where is it coming from? And that helps me move through it. But that's the learning of it, I think, starts with the writing. Because otherwise, I think it's hard for us to tap in. That's why writing's kind of like a sneak way into how we're feeling, because we don't have to like actually do something with other people involved. We can kind of play around with it on our own and figure out how to talk about it. And it gives us the space, the safe space to do that. Okay, let's move on to question 5. This question says, hi, Katie, I hope you're doing well. I am. I hope you're doing well. It says, I'm wondering how a relapse in an eating disorder is defined. Is there a clinical-based definition, or is it more of a gray area? I don't think there's like a clinical, I mean, if you meet the criteria for an eating disorder, you meet the criteria. But I think a relapse in general is when we slip back into eating disorder behavior. We'll talk about this. Let me finish this question. It says, does it mean meeting the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder diagnosis once again, or an amount of time someone has exhibited certain behaviors? What differentiates a slip up in recovery and a relapse? I've read articles speaking about how relapses are practically inevitable when recovering from an eating disorder. Yes, I recall feeling really discouraged with the term relapse, and it made the prospect of beginning recovery sound really intimidating. When I would slip up along the way, I would prefer to call it just that, for my own sake and to continue feeling motivated. And of course, thank you for all you do. It takes a special someone to work in your field. Oh, of course. Great question. Now, I call them slip ups too. And I like that you mentioned that. And I do it for the same reason, because I think relapse makes us sound like we're back at square one. We're never back at square one, by the way. Everything you've learned about yourself and your situation, all of the tools and resources you've utilized, all of the therapy work that you've done, that all still exists. Relapses, slip ups, whatever we want to call them, in eating disorder recovery are incredibly common because it's not about the food. It's about the fact that this is our coping skill. We don't know how else to cope. That's why there's also a ton of relapses when it comes to addiction. When we're in recovery from addiction, relapses are incredibly common, especially that first year. And I think eating disorders are no different. Also self-injury. And it's because that's what we go to when things get tough. And fucking life is hard, unfortunately. Especially right now, it feels like things are just crazy, right? And so it's very stressful. And that's what we turn to in times of stress. So I just want to give you a little compassion there, that like, that's why slip ups and relapses happen, is because this is tricky work. However, it does get better and it gets easier. And as we have these slip ups, we learn from them and we move forward. Now, a relapse is essentially when we've gone back to and are engaging in eating disorder behavior. That's how I define it. Now, some slip ups are like, oop, I know I restricted a little in that meal and I picked it up the next meal. That's actually great and it's helpful information and you really used your tools and things are all, it's like, yes. But I'd call that a little slip up. Does that mean that there's like, you did something wrong? No, it's just good to know that, hey, maybe something triggered that day. How stressed was I? Do I need other resources in the moment? Maybe I need more support meals? Like whatever it is, we need to consider, because we let the eating disorder take over in that moment. And I want to understand why. Now, relapses can also be like me not being in treatment, stopping my therapy, and going right back into my behaviors. I've had patients do that over the years. And we can slide back into it, just like we like behaviors and everything at the same amount that it was before we started therapy. And that it's just a spectrum of any way that we're still engaging with eating disorder behavior. I don't like when people, I don't really even like calling them relapses or even slip ups. I kind of just like calling it like it's just part of our process, because for some reason then it makes it, like you said, it makes it like more stressful to start the process. And I think it can also, one slip up can lead to us feeling like we're back at square one and we can lose hope. And I don't like any of that. And so in reality, I don't really talk about relapses so much with my patients. I do use the word slip ups. And I try to frame it in, this is really helpful. It's good that we know this and we can work to better prepare ourselves so it doesn't happen next time. And that's kind of just that's my stance on all of it, because that's the goal, right? And if we call it a relapse, it can feel, that's why I don't even like people counting the days. Like my self-injury patients will be like, I'm 100 days clean. I understand why people want to do that. But then if we have a slip up, we feel like we're back at square one, and that can cause us to feel more depressed. And we can feel like we can judge ourselves when you're doing amazingly well and you had a rough time and you used an unhealthy coping skill, but we're going to pick it back up. And we're going to try again next time. I just like that view a little bit better. I know it's so nuanced and you're like, Katie, does it really matter? It matters to me. And I think it matters to patients too. Like you said, the words are important. The language we use is really powerful. So let's make it one that's supportive. So if you don't like the word relapse, let's chuck it out of our vocabulary. If you prefer slip-ups, let's call it that. If you want to call it stumbles in my process, we can call it that. Whatever it is, a mistake. We all make mistakes. We're human. I probably made like 20 of them just this morning. It just is the way it is. And so I don't want you to feel like you have to move through A to B to C perfectly. That's not life, and it's not just eating disorder recovery. I think it's recovery from everything. If I was in recovery from people pleasing, then every time I put somebody else first, I'd be like, oh, I relapsed, right? And that would be all the time. Give yourself a little compassion. It's hard work what you're doing, and I think you're doing great. I know I'm probably getting off topic, but those are my thoughts. Hopefully that answers, your questions. I don't believe, at least in my work, there wasn't like a diagnostic criteria I was following. It was mainly just if you're re-engaging in those behaviors. Now there was an add-on that said, I'm wondering whether my weight restoration from anorexia constitutes recovery, despite me still struggling from binge restrict cycles and counting calories. My therapist stopped asking me about my eating disorder once I gained weight, but I still feel very disordered and focused on food and my body. Thank you for everything you do. I hate when this happens. I hate when a therapist stops asking about eating disorders because I don't know if they're a specialist. I'm hoping that they're not, because this is not right. We know that weight restoration has zero to do with the actual eating disorder. It's in our mind, not in our bodies. I wish that wasn't so, but it is so. And you have to heal them both at the same time. So even if if we're weight restored, but we're still disordered in our head, we're going to go right back into it because we haven't actually fixed the problem. It's not about the fucking food. The food is the way to cope. It's almost like they call it in addiction recovery, especially in alcohol, like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. They call them dry drunks. And those are people who decide not to drink anymore. So they white knuckle it, but they behave in addictive or addict type ways. And I have a couple of friends who have done that, who have been sober for years and they're dry drunks. They act just like an alcoholic does. They just happen to not have alcohol involved. There's actually a show that Sean was watching on TV called Louder Milk. It's on Netflix. He's a dry drunk. That's a good example of a dry drunk. We can all do those types of behaviors. It'd be like me being, that just has an easy term to put to it. But back to the people pleasing, if I'm still acting in those behaviors every so often, but just not that one way that we talked about, that's not actually fixing the problem. And so all that to say that you are in your recovery process. However, we need to work on the mental component. You've done a lot of work on the physical side and trying to gain weight, but because you're using food to cope and it's not actually about vanity, you're swinging into the other way, which is almost always what happens. Eating disorders are shapeshifters because they want to survive. They want to be around so we can use them to feel better. And so even if we're weight restored, that doesn't mean that we worked on the brain part of it, the actual mental health component, actually processing the reason our eating disorder exists. And so I believe we need to bring this up with our therapist ASAP. Let them know, hey, I still feel like I think about eating disorder stuff all the time. I know my weight's restored, but it's not better. I know it's hard to be honest. Be as honest as you can. At the very least, say, I'd really still like to talk about eating disorder stuff because I think about it all the time. Because that's what's really going on. So yeah, I don't believe weight restoration is the full recovery piece, but it's a part of it. I'd say I'd give weight restoration a good 30, 35% of the process. Okay, now there was an add-on that says, at what point can you begin not following such a strict meal plan? Good question. Also, is it normal for your eating disorder to change behaviors and methods through recovery? And would this be seen as good or a bad thing? Okay. When we get off a meal plan, a very strict meal plan, when our dietitian or whoever gave us the meal plan says so. And I know that's a shitty answer, but it's the truth, because I've had patients stay on meal plans for years. I've had patients stay on meal plans for 6 months. And I don't think I've ever had anybody stay on a meal plan less than 6 months, because it takes us time to not only get used to the food, and we start those meal plans usually in treatment, so that's a couple of months of very supported meal plan stuff. But when we go to the grocery store, those often come with like shopping lists, and that keeps us just focused. And a lot of my patients, I haven't done supportive shopping in years. I did it back when I worked in the treatment centers, but there's things like you look for your patients to make sure they're just grabbing the food that they're used to seeing. We try to let them see like the brands of what they're getting, so they just know what to get. Like, let's say we're doing, eggs and a bagel for breakfast. I want to make sure you're just grabbing the yellow carton of eggs that you're used to seeing and the Sara Lee bagels, for example, and you're just taking them. And if I see a patient look to see what's in things and look at the calorie and all the stuff on the back, the nutrition facts, that's not a good sign. They're probably not ready to be doing it all on their own. And so the meal plans will hang around for as long as we need them. And I feel like when we start eating more intuitively and without any kind of eating disorder increase in symptoms or thoughts, that's when the meal plan can kind of go away. And they usually do it little by little, or at least in my experience. So you go from a full meal plan to having like 2 free nights a week, like 2 lunch and a dinner or something. And starting out that way to see how we do little by little. But yeah, when you're ready, they'll take you off of it. Okay. And it is normal for our eating disorder to change behaviors and methods through recovery because it tries to hang around. Essentially, it will do that until we process the real reason exists, which would be something like we felt like everything was out of control growing up, and this gives us some sense of control. Maybe we use our eating disorder to numb out from a past trauma or a past upset. Or maybe we always thought our value was placed in us being small, and so we want to always remain small. Maybe it has to do with sexual abuse. It could be any number of reasons. And until we heal or process through that reason, our eating disorder will shapeshift. I mean, I've seen people have every eating disorder under the sun. Everything that you could be diagnosed with, they've had, because it's just their way of trying to continue having it because it serves a purpose, right? Now, another add-on, it says, is it possible to have an eating disorder due to ADHD? I'm not sure if I even have it, the ADHD, but my therapist diagnosed me with bulimia, and I read that there can be comorbidities. And since I was in therapy for depression and I go to uni, I notice a lot of things coming up, like inattentiveness and inner restlessness issues, or issues with memory. What would this mean for my eating disorder if it was due to my ADHD? I don't believe, so we can't have an eating disorder that's caused by ADHD. It would be one or the other. There's a part in a lot of diagnoses, I have to get my DSM out, and unfortunately I forgot to grab it. But there's a part in the DSM under every diagnosis that will say something to the effect of it can't be better explained by another mental illness. And not all of them are like this, but in the fact, like, for example, in like body dysmorphic disorder, BDD, they say that it can't be better explained through anorexia nervosa, right? And there's little things like this within the DSM. Obviously, the DSM is not the end all be all, but it helps us kind of tease out like, well, hey, where's this coming from? If I don't like my body, is it because I have an eating disorder, or is it specific to just it's my body? It has nothing to do with food, right? I'm not using food as a way to cope with that or try to change that. I am just always unhappy with how I look. I know that sounds very nuanced. Welcome to the DSM. It's very nuanced. And so when it comes to this question, your ADHD could exacerbate the symptoms of your eating disorder. I've had patients, especially if you're treated for ADHD, because stimulants can affect our hunger fullness cues. And so I've had patients who, almost, it's like, which one do we treat? Because if we treat the ADHD, the eating disorder gets worse. And so I've seen connections like that. Also, a lot of people with ADHD can forget to eat, can be kind of rigid about what they eat, want to eat the same thing every day until they get sick of it. And then it's like the most disgusting thing they've ever thought of. So there can be eating stuff associated with it. I guess you'd have to talk to your therapist about it. You'd have to tease that out. But I do not believe, especially because you said bulimia, I do not believe that would be caused by ADHD. I've seen more of the like binge or the restrict, but with purging behaviors, I haven't seen that connected to ADHD, but like, again, it could exacerbate some of those symptoms. So let your therapist know you're experiencing this. Let's keep track of the symptoms and what we think is going on. and then see if maybe in fact we do have ADHD and that it could, be making our eating disorder symptoms worse, or whatever the case might be. Okay. Final question is question number 6, says, how do you figure out what's just the human condition or a personality trait and what is an actual symptom? I thought this is a great question and kind of fun to answer, because I remember just so vividly seeing one of my patients when she was like she's entering her teen years. I saw her in treatment. Because if any of you don't know, I like 90% adults in my private practice. I saw some teens. This was one of them. And I remember when she became like that preteen, teenage era of her life, and we had a tough time teasing out what was her being a teenager and what was her eating disorder. And we spent a ton of time in therapy just trying to sort through that. Do we think this is about body image and food? Or is this just us kind of being a brat because we're mad at our mom? Right? And we'd have to be honest and talk about it and think about it. And I'd have to get really clever about the way that I ask the questions to try to figure that out. And so sometimes it's very tricky. However, I will tell you that the ways that I see symptoms is that we all have symptoms of things, but it's about full criteria. And this is where the DSM, we need something like it, right? It has to exist because we need to know how many of these things we're looking for, what creates this pattern that then looks like it's generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder, right? One symptom like, oh, I'm not sleeping that well lately. That doesn't mean I have depression or anxiety. It could, but it's just one little piece of the puzzle. And so I look at symptoms kind of as like, we all have a ton of them. And I try to keep track of them as a mental health professional as much as possible. And then I'm just looking for those patterns. And so when we start to get closer to a diagnosis, let's say that like in major depressive disorder, you have to have 5 of the following 9 symptoms. When my patients have like 3 and I'm questioning a 4th, that's when I start to really think about whether or not this is diagnosable. And if we should focus a lot of our treatment on major depressive disorder. Even if I don't think they're quite fully diagnosed, I might start working in that area. Because as a therapist in general, our work is about the symptoms that bother you and us finding remedy for that. A lot of that has to do with us properly diagnosing you. Like if it's PTSD, we should know it's PTSD and be working in that. If it's ADHD, we should know that, right? But a lot of the work in between is the symptoms that are bothering us now, and we might not know what the full diagnosis is, but we still want to operate that way. And so in short, I look for patterns because we all have symptoms of something, and that's the human condition. That's like personality traits, like, oh, somebody's shy. Well, is the shyness, are they terrified of being out and getting embarrassed, and so they won't go out? Then that sounds like it's more like anxiety, right? We all have these different traits and these different symptoms, but when they create a pattern, when they come together, and we have all of or almost all of the diagnostic criteria checked off, that's when it turns into an actual mental illness. I don't really worry so much about like symptoms. We can have a lot of different symptoms. I think we all have one symptom of, BPD and another symptom of depression or something like that. But that doesn't mean that we have those. That's just like one symptom that we express. And that could be for any number of reasons, right? Could have been the way that we were raised, could be something that we learned through another friend and a way to cope. It could have been, due to some bullying we experienced in high school, but we came through it. It could be any number of things. We all have the symptoms, but symptoms don't mean anything if they don't come together and coalesce into like a pattern. And obviously there's probably like more, I would say like scary symptoms, like a suicidality would be one. It's not its own diagnosis, like as, oh, we have one symptom and that means that. But that's something I would look into. That's like a serious symptom. But overall, we all have a ton of symptoms. But those are just part of who we are. That's part of the human condition. But when they come together and start to line up in a diagnostic way, that's when, that's when I pay attention to them. That's when they become more important and something that we should be focused on in a more direct way. Okay? I hope that helps and makes sense. Thank you all so much for listening and watching. Thank you for sending in your questions. And thank you for being part of the community. I know I do a ton of live streams and things, and I chat in the comments as much as possible, but I don't always take the time to thank you all for being there for me, for showing up, for hanging out. I really look forward to catching up from each and every one of you and hearing how you're doing, and just even through the questions. It's great to see where you all are at and how you're feeling and what's going on. And yeah, thank you for being part of the community. Have a wonderful week. Do your homework, and I'll see you next time.